The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM.
Hello, welcome to the MTSU SPED Collaborative, and we are about to start our second session for the day. We are happy to welcome people from 15 school districts today, so we're so glad you're here. We've got a great session coming up right now. I want to welcome Dr. Adrian Cook, who is the Exceptional Education Coach in Metro Nashville Public Schools. And I'd also like to welcome Mr. Christopher Floor, who is Transition Coordinator in Metro Nashville Public Schools. And they're going to present today on building inclusive mindsets. So, Dr. Cook, Mr. Floor, welcome today. And so I'll give it to you.
Well, thank you for having us. We've kind of broken up today's presentation into two different sections as we'll go into. The beginning part is a little bit more legal guru stuff, and then we'll be moving into how does that pertain to inclusive practices. My name, as she said, is Dr. Adrian Cook, and I really liked how you guys gave some anecdotes about your own history, so I'm just going to give you a little example of what I've been doing in education for the past few years. So this is my 13th year in Metro Nashville Public Schools. I've been in this role as an exceptional education coach for 8 years. My teaching background, however, prior to that was in what we at the time called life skills. As of right now, it is modified curriculum in Metro, which is sometimes also referred to as low incidence. In my role as a special education coach, I serve 6 schools. Most of those are middle schools. I have a caseload of just about 400 IEPs. My role is predominantly supporting the teachers and administrators and making sure that our practices are both instructionally appropriate and compliant. And of course, my background in low incidence makes me really, really passionate about that particular population, as you heard in our last presentation. I'll let Mr. Floor introduce himself.
Hi everybody, I'm Christopher Floor, and I'm the Transition Coordinator with Metro Nashville Public Schools. I've been in education since about 2010. I started my career up in Newark, New Jersey. Anybody from Jersey in the room? No? No? Okay, well I'll represent. And then came down to Nashville in 2012. I taught in a middle school for 5 years, was the department lead there as well, supported the RTI program, and then I moved into the exceptional education coach role for 5 years in 2017, and then this year started a new position with the district as the transition coordinator. So I work primarily with high schools. There are 5 specific high schools in Nashville that I coach and support, and then I also support transition efforts that are occurring throughout the city and in MNPS. And that is me. I'll pass it back to you, Adrienne.
All right, so we're going to start with a welcoming ritual. We believe strongly in adhering to those social emotional learning practices that are best practices in the classroom. We're going to use them with you today. So before we begin, on that little notepad, that's going to be your note catcher today, but that little notepad, please answer a few questions to yourself and be ready to share out just if you've got a few things to add. So what is inclusion? We talked a little bit about co-teaching, but what exactly is inclusion? And what makes it meaningful? And we'll give you about 30 seconds to jot some ideas down.
I love it. All the pens are moving.
High engagement. Placing a little more emphasis on what is meaningful inclusion.
Was it your first question or your second? I'm sorry. I was going to answer the meaningful.
Go ahead with the meaningful.
I think when you can meet students' priorities and families' priorities for that child, then it's definitely meaningful. So I'm thinking about outcomes first.
priorities being met, yes. So everybody has different values out of their educational experience. What makes it meaningful to you? Any other feedback? I think a lot of us automatically default to what we know is not meaningful, right? Because that's easy to say, right? What isn't meaningful? Just being in the room physically doesn't make it meaningful, does it? Right. So we just wanted to activate that background knowledge, your schema, thinking about what is inclusion and what makes it meaningful, because we'll be going into that a little bit more today. So that was our welcoming ritual. We're going to go over some norms prior to diving into the rest of our presentation. We're going to be asking you guys to do some brave conversations today, because we're going to be talking about not just inclusive mindsets, but what might be barriers to that and some of those biases and implicit biases we have going into the classroom. So I'm going to be asking you guys to be vulnerable. Look at your own growth first. Everybody's coming from a different standpoint and different background experience, so focus on where you stand. Accept non-closure. We may not agree on everything. That might not happen, and we have to be okay with it. Take the perspective of others. Hear what someone else has to say and onboard it. Assume best intentions. I don't think anyone here is coming with anything other than good intentions. Lean into the discomfort and fear. It makes it really hard to share when you know you've maybe done something in the past that could have been not as inclusive as we'd like it to be. Think critically. That's an easy one. Let's look at our own thinking, that metacognition. Consider impact over intent, and practice mindfulness. I read them kind of slowly so you'd have a second to think about those words and digest what it means. These are different kind of norms. These are brave space norms. So we are asking you guys to first and foremost be vulnerable with us today, and we are going to be looking for quite a bit of engagement. So I know we haven't had lunch yet, no excuses. All right.
A lot of reflection happening today.
Outcomes we're working towards today: to be more mindful of exclusionary language and harmful mindsets about students with disabilities, and to understand the legal basis of inclusion. Those two do go hand in hand, and when we were first approached to maybe come to this presentation and what were we going to present, one of the things that came up on that feedback form you guys had shared with us was there was some questions about legal proceedings, the law behind why we do some of the things. So we're going to start with that, which I know sounds a little boring, but it's so important we understand it, and then tie that into why is that relevant to inclusive practices and how we can be more cognizant of those practices. It's a little bit tiny on this screen, but this is our continuum of special education services. This just happens to be the one that we use in Metro, but the continuum is based off of that federal guidance that we all adhere to in special education. When we look at this triangle, you'll see that at the very top is the most students. Students must be educated in their least restrictive environment to the maximum extent possible. So when you look at those bars on the left there, at the very top is general education classes. That is where most students exist, right? If they aren't receiving any services and they're in the gen ed classroom, that is the least restrictive environment. Moving down that continuum of services, you've got general education classroom with special education support. So that might look like a paraprofessional or another related service provider coming into that setting to improve opportunities for access, right? Moving right below that, you've got your co-teaching situations where we've got a full-time second adult teaching alongside you to ensure both equitable access and meaningful inclusion to the physical environment and to the content, all right? Beneath that, you've got your special education classroom for a portion of the day. A lot of us call that intervention or pullout. That is moving towards the more restrictive of settings, because now you've removed their opportunity to be around same age typical peers. And so when you've done that, you've created a fully special education setting, which is no longer what we would consider inclusive. So special education classroom for a majority of the day is where you've now, what we would often refer to it as a self-contained classroom. With the exception of maybe lunch and related arts, there aren't a lot of opportunities in this student's day to be around their typical peers or to be exposed to those core content classes being taught by highly qualified core content teachers. I don't know about you, but when I was in the low incidence life skills, whatever we call it now, classroom, I was being asked to teach 4 subjects across 4 grade levels. I was highly qualified to do what I was trained to do, but I was not a highly qualified math, science, social studies, and ELA teacher. So those are the things that our children miss out on when we don't look for those inclusive opportunities. Below that, just to kind of go quickly, we have special day schools, homebound, and even hospital and residential facilities. Those spectrum of services, going from least to most restrictive, are things we have to consider when we develop the IEP at every single meeting. Are we looking for the opportunity to include students in their least restrictive environment as much as possible? Because that is their right. This is information I am going to assume you all already know, because you've all written IEPs. You've all been here for a while. But we already know that core instruction and transition is what special education is all about. Access to core instruction, exposure to those content standards at a grade level, at their proper grade level, and then building in transition components to prepare them for not just next year, not for just high school, but for post-secondary life. This is a 13-year prep program. We are getting kids ready from K through 12 to be successful, independent, socially aware, competent adults when they leave us, because life will happen regardless of whether or not we provide what they have to have in school. So we need to make sure what they do get in school is going to serve them in the long run. And so all these different components circle around core instruction and transition. These are the building blocks of a strong IEP. And I always say an IEP is a great, great thing. And when we write a great IEP, it feels good. But it's only as great as we implement, as we implement it. So if the piece of paper looks great, but the practices don't match, we still got a lot of work to do. And in the society we are in right now, inclusion is kind of where that really hits the hardest. And making sure those inclusive opportunities through our co-teaching practices are aligning with what our children actually need as identified in that individualized education plan. So turning on our critical thinking and a little bit of fill in the blank here, we've got a paragraph, and I want you guys to try and figure out what would fit best in some of these blanks. It's a little tough, but I'll read the paragraph with blanks, and you guys think of what words make sense there. Inclusive education views blank as the norm and ensures a high quality education for every blank by setting blank standards and providing effective instruction along with necessary blank for blank. A lot of blanks, maybe too many blanks. But I'll give you 30 seconds to look at that paragraph and think about what might go in there and discuss with your partner if you need to. Go ahead.
I don't know the first one. Do you know the first one?
Do you want to give any hints, Chris?
Okay.
I like the discussion. Let's let him have it.
Ensures high quality education for every student by setting high standards and providing effective instruction along with necessary accommodations, tools or accommodations.
Okay.
Tools for achievement. Or you could put effective instruction along with necessary accommodations for everyone.
Either one.
Accommodations
with necessary
for
accommodations for achievement.
achievement. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the first one? Did
She
you
said
say?
academic.
Academic.
Inclusive education views academic.
As the norm. and
Academics as the norm and ensures for academics for every student by setting high standards.
All right. Let's see. Any ideas on the first one?
The academics.
We have diversity.
Yep.
That was a tricky one.
Anybody get close to it? Nope. Okay.
It's a little tough. It's a little tough. We're just trying to activate those brain cells today. Inclusive education views diversity as the norm and ensures a high quality education for every Good job. By
Got it.
setting rigorous, high,
Close.
synonyms, we'll take it. Setting rigorous standards and providing effective instruction along with necessary support
Okay.
for
academic success.
success. Oh, you guys are good. That was good. You might have done better than me the first time he showed it to me. I was like, oh man. All right, good job. All right, so now we get into the nitty-gritty, the fun stuff, right? What does the law say? So going back to the basis for where these practices come from. Federal and state laws and regulations require schools to provide accommodations and or modifications to make sure that students with disabilities have access to an appropriate education program. I hate to read off the screen, but when it comes to legal stuff, I like to get it right. And I said the or with modifications because there's only one population that should be receiving modifications, right? Right? Yeah. That is our students who are on a modified curriculum. Modifications are not appropriate otherwise. Back to the other piece, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, which we did say was created in 2004, but it was recently reauthorized back in 2015 and again in 2008 prior to that, requires that students with disabilities have the opportunity to be involved in and make progress in the general curriculum. This is our primary guiding legislation that really dictates that whole point of access. Two other pieces of legislation, which I'm sure back in, roll back a few years into those college classes, I know you've covered it. If it sounds familiar, I'm going to refresh your memory. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, specifically Section 504 of that act, requires that accommodations be provided to students with disabilities even if they don't have an IEP. So that's another guiding legislation. And of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, or you might refer to it as the ADA, right, prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. And a lot of that dictates some things like our physical environment. We have to have accessible schools with ramps, with accessible restrooms. All those things ensure that we have provided equitable access both for the environment and for the content to students with disabilities. Any questions about the law? We're going to get deeper, don't worry. Oh, it's going blue. Okay. I think I clicked too many times now. I don't know. Okay. So federal least restrictive environment requirements. Everybody here has heard of LRE. I'm going to assume that, right? LRE has several components, and we're just going to revisit them together. Each public agency, school, should, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, should ensure, that children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled. Oh, so there's that access piece again. Then that special classes, separate schooling, or removal of children with disabilities from the general education environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in general classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. I'm going to let you sit with that one for a minute because it's a lot of words. Reread it again in your head and think about that one. Any initial thoughts or feedback when you read this section?
Can I expound on occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that the second half of it?
Yeah, so when we talk about the only if piece, right? When we come to an IEP meeting, we get to the services page and we're talking about where are we going to provide these services? We have that conversation with every kid no matter what their disability, right? Being ID, for example, having an intellectual disability has nothing to do with where the service is provided. You can be intellectually disabled and fully included. It is a team decision and it is a data-based decision. So if we have data that indicates that the student's disability is severe enough or the nature of their disability warrants what cannot be provided in a general education classroom through services and supplementary aids, then we then can consider moving to a more restrictive environment and moving down that continuum. But we also need to be cognizant of not going from 0 to 100. How do we go from fully included to self-contained? We have to look at the continuum. Have we considered paras? Have we considered modifications? Have we considered other ways to keep them in that least restrictive environment to the greatest extent possible? If you are not doing those processes in your IEP meetings, you are not compliant. You're denying children a free and appropriate public education that aligns with this least restrictive environment subsection. And that is something we have dealt with in our role as coaches a lot, and it's a real sticking point. It has to be data-based. Moving on to the next section, a child with a disability is not removed from education in age-appropriate general classrooms solely because of the needed modifications in the general curriculum. Like the example I just shared with you earlier, a label or an eligibility doesn't have anything to do with where we serve that child's needs. Every single child, regardless of disability, is required to have a legally convened IEP team meeting where we discuss services based off the data we've gathered relating to that individual student. We do not say, oh, all kids with autism, no matter what you need, get put in this, what do they call them, the old autism label classes?
CBIP?
We used to call them CBIP. They don't have that anymore. But like, we cannot just group a child based off eligibility or disability alone in a specific setting. We tend to do it with the children who have more behaviors or more cognitive impairments. And that is not fair. It is not fair, it is not inclusive, and it isn't equitable. And so we need to move away, and we challenge you to think about that mindset and encourage conversations, hard conversations with your colleagues going back, because you're probably the most progressive ones when it comes to those mindsets in our buildings. This isn't a conversation a lot of our gen ed teachers think about or have. So moving on, this is a continuum of that previous one. It says a continuum of alternative placements is available to meet the needs of children with disabilities, including instruction in general classes, special schools, home instruction, and instruction in hospitals. So referring back into that tiny little image in the corner when it was big, it is legally required that we offer a full continuum of services at every district. You cannot say, we do not offer this. Well, good luck. That won't hold water in court. And I hate to say it, I'm involved in a lot of due processes in my job, and that kind of stuff gets us every time. I'm in the middle of a hearing right now.
Hey, Adrian, can we survey the room really quick? So thinking about the continuum of services, in the work that you all are doing every day, how many of you are spending maybe more than 50 or 60% of your time at the top of the pyramid? So that's embedded into general education classrooms, providing accommodations in gen ed, co-teaching, et cetera. Okay. If you had to give that a percent, what would it be, Adrian?
In this room, maybe about 50, 60.
Okay. How about more in the middle? So students are getting pulled out for part of the day, or self-contained classrooms, like approaching the other end of the spectrum. Okay. Okay. So not more than half a day? Okay. Anybody working like a special day school or a public separate school? Okay, fantastic. Sorry, I just wanted to get an idea of who was here.
Yeah. Well, and some of us are not directly serving students anymore in the classroom, which is okay. We've moved on to different types of hard. That's how I feel like it. So yeah, I feel like this slide is super important, but very overlooked because everybody, takes for granted the fact that we do offer a full continuum of services. But when you're also, putting yourself in the shoes of a parent who has a child with a disability and is considering, what are my options here in the school setting, or maybe even out of the school setting if necessary, legally, they're entitled to these things and they have a right to advocate for that based off of whatever their child's needs are. But at the end of the day, those inclusive opportunities that give them access to their typical peers is the gold standard and what we always want to move towards. And that is supported by the law. And that's kind of where we are starting from. Raise your hand if you've heard of the least dangerous assumption. Okay, this is a real core tenet. This is actually in the Tennessee Department of Special Education's framework. So this is a state thing, but it is also widely recognized across the country and even in the world about this concept of least dangerous assumption. So the least dangerous assumption states that in the absence of absolute evidence, it is essential to make the assumption that, if proven to be false, would be least dangerous to the individual. I'm reading it very slowly because it's convoluted to hear. Considering general education first for all students, regardless of disability, is a critical component of the least dangerous assumption. Evidence and data collected, see that part's underlined? Data should be discussed at each IEP meeting before making the determination that a student requires a more restrictive setting. I like to use my IED student as an example again because a lot of times there are maybe implicit biases or assumptions made about the potential of a student with a cognitive disability that is nowhere based in data. You can have a cognitive disability, but that does not mean you do not benefit from and show progress in exposure and access to the gen ed core content, possibly with modifications. But exposure to your peers and exposure to a high quality teacher to receive that rigorous content is crucial to doing that. You cannot assume that they would not benefit unless you have data with evidence to say otherwise. So moving a child to a more restrictive setting because it's convenient, because there's classes available, or because their difficult behavior makes it hard to modify or accommodate them in that room is not a valid reason. You cannot move a child into a more restrictive setting because it's inconvenient for you. You cannot. It is not data-based, nor is it based in best practices. And I say that with a lot of fervor because it is a conversation we have all the time. It keeps happening.
Adrian, can I ask you this? Do you feel like parents just aren't aware of this? Like that there's this culture in our schools and parents of kids who have intellectual disabilities that just aren't aware. They're just doing it because we've always done practice this way.
I think a lot of families look to us as the experts for guidance because this is not a clear-cut world that we live in. Special education and navigating it from a parent perspective when this isn't what you went to school for and don't have background in is completely overwhelming. I have a 5-year-old in kindergarten. He does not have a disability, but he has special accommodations that he requires in the classroom. And coming to his school from a parent perspective, having done this for 13 years, my heart about pounded out of my chest. I thought I was gonna cry every time they said anything that wasn't beautifully positive, and I was like in my feelings. I could not get out. It like shut my frontal cortex down. I could not think straight. I could not come up with a solution. And this is what I do every day. And so pretend you're a parent who doesn't have that background and their emotions are high and you're dealing with their families and you're saying, this is what's best for your kid. You want to believe them because you want someone to take you by the hand and say, I have your kid's best interest and I'm going to look out for them. And a lot of families do believe them, and they should. I don't want them to not trust schools. We want to build that relationship and we want to be trustworthy. But it hasn't always been in the best interest of students, and it has not always been data-based. So keeping in mind that you're dealing with families who are in a very fragile state sometimes, especially at that very first kindergarten, like elementary, this is their first experience with school. It might be their only child with a disability. We are working with people. And so we have to remember that while the law guides us, we work with people and we have to make decisions not based in our emotions and opinions, but based off what's evidentially best practices and based in the law. And that's really hard to do sometimes.
And thinking about this historic culture that is so present in so many of our schools, and y'all, as we hear her speak, I think we agree that this is happening, where we're taking kids from an inclusive setting and putting them in restrictive settings without really good decisions, right, and data to drive that. But I have a fear that administrators aren't always aware of some of these practices, these legal, it's not best practice, this is a legal practice, right? And so I'm just wondering in Metro, and I know I'm getting to the Q&A before you're ready, but in Metro in particular, what are you finding? Is it admins that don't always understand and interpret this? Because I think it's meaningful for us to take back to our schools and districts and think about how do we get this message out there that this is something we should all be doing in our schools.
One of the things our district does do, I think, well, and granted I've only ever worked in the one district, so I can't compare, but our roles as special education coaches, and we also have directors above us who supervise individual like quadrants and tiers, we have a really sole purpose, and that is to go into these buildings and look at the practices and support teachers instructionally, look for areas of compliance that need support, educate. We do trainings. We have a 4-part co-teaching training that's an ongoing follow-up series where we meet with individual grade level teams to build capacity at a very small level and then go back out, zoom back out. Like this is our literal purpose. And I feel like that we've seen a lot. I've been in this district 13 years, and when I first was hired, I was hired as a life skills teacher, and it was the first year we'd had every single school serving every single student in their school of zone. Prior to that, they were clusters where we were having one school serving all the kids in this area who had autism. And so like coming from then to where we are now, we've made huge gains, but the work remains.
In terms of data, in 2009, only 40% of students with disabilities in Metro Nashville Public Schools were included for 80% of the day or more. And now that number, I believe, is over 70.
It's around 70%.
Yeah, and so we've made huge gains.
Our goal, which is in alignment with the indicator 5 data, which states that we seek to have 80% of our students with disabilities educated in the general education setting for at least 80% or more of the day. So we've had, AYPs and goals and whatever all these acronyms, like to move that number up, and we have seen that happen over time. And now we're really focusing on these inclusive practices, because now that they're there, what are they getting out of that? And is it meaningful? So in the interest of time, now you know the legal basis for inclusion. Let's talk about the mindset of inclusion, because often that is our biggest barrier to those practices.
All right, y'all. So I was being really quiet in the beginning, but now you're going to get to hear me talk a little bit. But I'm also going to ask you to do a lot of heavy lifting for this next part of the session. This is where we're really going to be thinking about what does inclusion look like? What are our values regarding inclusion? And how does this all play out in various classrooms, okay? So I want you guys to imagine some different classrooms that you all have been in, right? And think about them as on a continuum between exclusionary on the one end and inclusive on the other.
And if you want, on the piece of paper that we shared with you, if you grab a blank one, we would love to encourage you to draw this little graph on your own paper with a little I for inclusive, a little E for exclusionary, and we'll tell you what goes on the other coordinate plane in just a moment, the y-axis.
So we're thinking about that, and then I want you to intersect that continuum, and you're going to intersect that continuum with fixed mindset and growth mindset, okay? So you can have a classroom that's very inclusive, that has a culture of a growth mindset. What does that look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? Maybe what are some words that could describe it? Then you move over to quadrant 2. What does an exclusionary classroom look like where there is a strong growth mindset? What's happening in that room? What are things you would hear in it? How would you describe it?
And for those of you at home participating virtually, we encourage you to plug in at least one per quarter and share it in the chat so we can get your perspective as well.
And then quadrant 3, we have an exclusionary classroom where there's a culture of fixed mindset. What does that look like? And then lastly, Q4, which is an inclusive classroom, but there are fixed mindsets in the culture. So now I'm going to give you guys...
Do we need to do a little explanation about growth versus fixed mindset, or does everybody feel comfortable with the difference between those two?
Thumbs up, thumbs side, thumbs down.
Okay.
Okay.
Didn't want to make assumptions.
Fantastic. So I'm going to give you guys... How are we on time, by the way?
We have about 45 minutes left to present.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys, we're going to start with 5 minutes, and if we need to add a couple of minutes, we can do that. But you guys are going to fill out all of these different quadrants, and you're also going to do it at your table groups. And so start to have conversations, because what you're going to find is that there are many different angles to view these classrooms. And I have always, this is I think my 4th time doing this training, am blown away by what teachers have to say about some of the classrooms that they see in their schools. So it is 11:18. We've got 5 minutes, and Adrian, take us off.
I was just going to say, thinking about it from a student perspective sometimes helps you respond to these. Like, if I were the student, what would I be seeing? What would I be hearing? How would I be feeling given a teacher whose mindset is one of those, combinations?
Shut up. Hold on, wait.
With no accommodations.
You just come on. Oh, never mind. All right, so for this one, we're going to say no supports, no
support.
modifications, no accommodations. I just really want to write David Reeves. And then what would the second one be?
You just, what do you
Honey, I
mean?
wrote it that on number 1 because that's just part of his. What is that D word that I can't think of right now that he doesn't do?
Diverse, differentiate. It's the same thing.
What?
You've all seen those, right? Yep. What are y'all coming up with?
Listen, if you want to walk for Q3, you just hit me up.
So which
Is this-
Q3 is exclusionary?
Yeah,
and
and
fixed,
fixed
right?
mindset.
Okay, so
And is this PowerPoint going to be available? Yeah. Thank God. I can't wait.
so like in like an exclusionary classroom with a fixed mindset, like either the students are like designated somewhere, students with disabilities are designated somewhere else, they're not really engaged in the classroom, and there's no like plan or intention of getting them to the
And they all make a 60 because they can't do that.
yes.
I told you, I got you on this one. I'm facing that battle every day. This would be the growth mindset, but it's exclusive.
But provides opportunities for high-level instruction
Okay, interesting.
because they have the growth mindset there.
I have heard the most diversity of responses on the quad too when teachers are talking about it. Like coming up with situations that just have blown my mind where I'm like, oh yes. Yep. 5 seconds, we're coming back whole group. 3, 2.5, 2 and 25 hundredths. Anybody ever do that? Like do number sense counting? No? It keeps me on my toes. All right, y'all, bring it back, bring it back, bring it back. For those of you who are with us virtually, thank you so much for being here and joining us. I've already heard that there are great comments that are coming through the chat, and so we look forward to hearing about that. Any type of prompts that come out from us, you can include that information in the chat, and if you have questions, you can also put your questions in the chat, and we can respond to them either later in the training or during the Q&A after the session, y'all, okay? So, who wants to talk to me about quadrant 1?
So that's an inclusive classroom with a growth mindset. What does that look like, sound like, feel like? Were there any chat comments for quadrant 1? Okay. Anybody want to volunteer?
So I would just say that they have really strong relationships with all students. They don't view students as special ed or gen ed, and that they do accommodate and modify and support our special ed kids that are in there, and they don't treat them any differently.
Quadrant 1, we can safely say, is the goal.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We want inclusive with a growth mindset, right?
And from one of our viewers, quadrant 1 would be what is strived for. All students having access to Tier 1 instruction and being open to the power of yes.
I love it. I love it. Quadrant 2. Let me hear. By the way, quadrant 2 is the quad that I've heard the most diversity of responses on over the last couple of sessions. So what did y'all come up with?
So that's an exclusionary classroom, or a classroom with exclusionary practices, and the teacher does have a growth mindset. That's kind of an interesting combination. Yes, ma'am.
So I think that's kind of where we went, and we said that it's could possibly be a classroom where the teacher has a growth mindset, but only for a select set of students. So like it's like almost like the teacher maybe is ability tracking the students. So it looks like the students are separated. It sounds like the teacher is only boosting like her selected or his selected pick of students. And then it feels like isolated learning because it's not inclusive of the entire group, but just, who the teacher has selected as this is the group that can learn. So it's still growth, but growth only towards a selected bunch or targeted group inside of one class.
I love it. Does somebody have anything else? Quad 2. Yep.
From one of our viewers, quad 2, SWD being kept separate from Tier 1, but are being brought into the Tier 1 classroom to work.
Okay. Interesting. Oh, that wasn't a hand?
Stretching.
I just said separate but equal. That's
Yeah. Yep. All right. What about quad 3?
So that's exclusionary and a fixed mindset. So probably the least desirable combination. And we probably all know what that might sound like, look like, feel like.
I have a word for it, but I'm going to wait until I hear some folks.
Go ahead. Laura.
From one of the viewers in quad 3, old school self-contained thought process is that SWD should be educated separate of Tier 1.
I would say that they don't support or modify or accommodate anything. And they don't differentiate their instruction.
Yeah. I think some of those universal design for learning strategies, we're not believing that all students can benefit from exposure to core content and or learn.
I call it babysitting. Yeah. Right? Because, is anything really happening in that classroom? Is there meaningful academic engagement? Is there growth happening? And probably not.
Imagine being a student in a classroom like that, what that feels like. Unwanted.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd show up to class.
If you did, you'd probably be staying.
Maybe I would.
Yep. All right, last quad 4.
So that's inclusive but fixed. So we're inclusive, but don't believe that growth can happen or that you have a potential that maybe we've reached. What does that look like, sound like, feel like? Yes? And
I love reading the facial expressions on y'all. That's how I know you're like, I've seen this before, right? Right?
yes.
Quad 4. Any child can come into my classroom, but they'll have to make their own way.
I'm going to give that snaps.
Remember where our norms, be vulnerable.
Yep. Lean in,
take
y'all.
risks. We're nice, I promise. One last thought.
It's inclusive, but we're just gonna stick to what's on this paper. We're just gonna stick to the directions, and I'm gonna give you the directions and do your work.
So I'm going to have you here, but not have expectations for you. Yep.
That sounds familiar.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what's the takeaway? What do you think the takeaway is to this activity? Take 30 to 60 seconds. What's the key takeaway here?
We have about 30 minutes.
I said we have a long way to go with this.
And what people, like Mr. David, if we were in there with
Some
him.
folks processing.
But there's nobody in there to help him. So he feels
He doesn't want help. He's been offered help. He doesn't want help.
Bring it back in 10, 9, 5, 2, 1. I went in order, though. I went in order. 0. Number sense. All right, can I hear somebody? What's the takeaway here?
Be mindful how we deliver.
Okay, be mindful of how we deliver instruction. Let me hear from 2 more people.
We said that we noticed that you see more of Q3 and Q4 versus Q1 and Q2, but in my opinion, it goes back to what we talked about in the first session with just that lack of planning and collaboration between the general teacher and the co-teacher.
Absolutely. Anybody else? Anybody on virtual? Okay.
I think it helps to reflect on your practices and it help you evaluate your own thought processes towards students with disabilities learning.
Yeah. I really like on what you're touching there because it's where we have students matters, right? But what also matters just as much is what we believe the kids can do. And that is going to create these different scenarios. It's really how we feel and what we think about the students that's creating that environment.
And when we have this discussion on this grid, talking about inclusive, exclusionary, or fixed, or growth, it gives us words to explain why someone is like they are or why we are like we are, and perhaps how to fix it.
You are like leading us right into the next slide.
Let's do it.
Perfect. That is perfect. So let's talk about why we do the things we do, or why students do what they do. So we've got a term up. Anybody who took a psychology class back in your undergrads may have studied fundamental attribution error. So this refers to the tendency to attribute one's own mistakes or misdeeds to external factors while attributing the mistakes and misdeeds of others to dispositional or internal factors. So when evaluating others, we underestimate the situational factors and we overestimate the role of personality and intrinsic factors. So that's if we're like somebody's late for work and you throw a character judgment on it, right? They don't care about their job. But then I'm late for work and it's like, oh my God, I couldn't get the coffee maker to work and I was just trying to get my breakfast and I know I needed to have a good day, right? So we all see that in ourselves, right?
Otherwise termed as hypercritical of others, not hypercritical enough of yourself.
Absolutely. And for a lot of folks, it's kind of what we default to, right? Just like as a consequence of our own interior lives. Like, well, we know our background story, so we can explain that, but we don't know others. And so the easiest way to describe it is to throw a judgment on it, right? So take that and bring it into how you think about your students, right? And I'm going to pose a question to all. And again, you can turn and talk for about 30 seconds. I want you to complete this sentence. Fundamental attribution error can lead to fixed mindsets by ... So fundamental attribution error can lead to fixed mindsets, and you can put a parentheses about students with disabilities, by blank. Tap the table when you think you have a response. Okay, I got one tap.
Special education students cannot.
We got folks corresponding, talking, thinking it through.
And for those of you virtual, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat. We really encourage you to keep the engagement high and participate. You have the benefit of a screen, so no risk there. Just share what you think.
All right, let's bring it back. 3, 2, 1. First tap I heard was over here at this table. Talk to me. Complete the sentence.
By assuming students with IEPs cannot learn general ed content standards.
Okay. I like it. It makes sense. Let me hear from someone else. So we've heard about assumptions. Right? And that is what fundamental attribution error is. It's assumptions that we're making about somebody's background story, right?
Could it be like a fixed mindset of just assuming that you're always right and everybody else is always wrong?
Yeah,
What if
absolutely.
you had a student who came to you and you got their backstory before you even met them, such as a CUME file, I don't know, and that file had DCS caseworkers, it had their light bill for their house so that they could prove their address, but you looked their address up on Zillow. And then you checked out that light bill wasn't so great and hadn't been paid. And then, like, you've already got all this background information about a student, and you also know that they have an emotional disturbance and that they are living in a foster home and that this is not a good, like, you've probably already made judgments about that individual, and you've also decided what their capacity is. You've probably unintentionally and probably not consciously said, this kid's got a lot of barriers that are going to prevent him from making progress, so we're just going to start with that and not hold high expectations. Has anyone ever encountered a situation like that? Maybe been part of one?
Yeah, a lot of hands going up.
That could be a fixed mindset that's really dangerous. Did we just automatically assume things about this kid, and did we just increase his likelihood of being a dropout later because we haven't engaged with them the way that we would have if we didn't know this information?
I was a big teacher as well for 6 years. Too long for this old lady.
Let me ask you all a question. Do you all have something that you need to have in place to stay organized? Yes. Yeah, everyone, right? Like, everybody's got a planner. Or, like, if you don't put something in my Outlook calendar, it could be meeting the president, and I would not show up for it. If it is not in my Outlook calendar, I don't have the executive functioning skills to hold that information in my head. It's just, I just don't have it, right? And here's my next question. Did you always know those strategies? No, you had to pick it up somewhere, right? And a lot of times, when we're looking at our students with disabilities and we fall into this fundamental attribution error, you're missing that opportunity to see them on a trajectory of growth, okay? And you want to think about where the student is in that journey, because they're going to get to the point where perhaps you are, where we've learned to accommodate ourselves, we've learned to get ourselves functioning. And so that all kind of boils down to implicit bias, right? So how do we define that? Implicit bias is the tendency to process information based on unconscious associations and feelings, even when these are contrary to one's conscious or declared beliefs. While implicit biases impact everyone, the identities most often harmed by implicit bias tend to be the elderly, obese, BIPOC people, students with disabilities, right? Because when you're looking at the power at play, that's where implicit bias can really do some harm. And so, well, what are ways that our implicit biases might manifest in the classroom? Another way that you can think about this, and you guys can stop and jot this down, Another way you can think about this is those classrooms we were describing a couple minutes ago on the coordinate plane, what beliefs would lead to those types of classrooms? So again, the prompt is, and this is an invitation to discomfort, stop and jot one way implicit bias can manifest towards individuals with disabilities in our classrooms.
I'm going to give you 1 minute.
Yep.
We're running short on time.
Should see the thinking caps. Do teachers still say that? No? Put your thinking caps on. Is that a 90s thing? No? Okay. Cool. I want to make sure I wasn't dating myself.
And they're not.
As I date
They're not as smart as the other counterparts. Especially when it comes to discrimination.
All right, let me hear some examples as you finish writing down your sentence. Let me get an example.
I was going to say, student supports are too extensive. Maybe that's challenging behavior to be in the general ed classroom. I can't do it without a paraprofessional there. They're going to have a one-to-one aide. I can't do it. I don't have a para to go out. It's not on the IEP. I can't do it. Yep. They're going to have to be in a resource setting or intervention setting, self-contained,
Or this student, I saw him do this. He had this huge tantrum. He's got to go to special day school. That's where kids who have those behaviors go.
Yep.
Right? Anybody else? Let me hear one more.
Predetermining based on cognitive referencing.
Say it one more time.
Predetermining based on cognitive referencing.
I love it.
Do y'all know what cognitive referencing is? Maybe give us an example of what you had in mind.
Presuming the ID student that you keep referencing has an IQ of 52, that they can never learn any skills that a typical student would because they have an IQ of 52.
And an example I like to share outside of my usual ID reference, I've encountered this a lot where a student with a physical handicap of some sort, maybe with a child with cerebral palsy in a wheelchair, but there is not a cognitive impact. People assign capability assumptions based off the way they physically look rather than what you actually get out of them. Maybe they have a speech impediment because of their cerebral palsy. People assume that speech impediment and physical handicap mean you cannot do something when nothing could be further from the truth.
And the reverse is true for individuals with disabilities you can't see. So invisible disabilities like high functioning autism. Dyslexia.
Yeah, good point. We got something in the virtual?
And a general comment from virtual, a general broad comment, assuming that students need to fit within your box and there is no room within your classroom for any outliers.
I love it. Again, and that cuts really to the heart of it. Like, what are our ideas about students? And most importantly, what are the ones that are in your blind spot, right? Because do you know how you can determine if you have implicit bias? Okay, are you human? Raise your hand. Can all the humans raise your hand? Okay. And humans that live in society, can you all raise your hand? Yes. All right. Well, so if you're a human, you live in society, you will have implicit bias. This is going to impact our classroom. Now, sometimes it could take an even more harmful direction, right? And so we're going to talk about microaggressions for these last couple of minutes, right? So what are microaggressions? Well, these are everyday slights, indignities, put-downs, insults that people of color, women, LGBTQI plus populations, or those who are marginalized or who have marginalized experiences that they experience in their day-to-day interactions with people. And so there's 3 types of microaggressions. And by the way, shout out to the MNPS Diversity Office and Equity Office that produced some of the slides for this training. It's phenomenal. Yep. So on the topic of microaggressions, we're going to flip behavior analysis on its head. Usually, you do a behavior analysis on a student, right? If you are exhibiting a microaggression, the behavior analysis should come to you, right? Because what is the function of those statements? So say students misbehaving, the behavior would be a microaggression that associates the student's behavior with their identity. Like, she is just bad. What's the consequence? If we're doing ABC data, what's the consequence? It can go in a couple of directions, right? It could be, well, because the student is just bad, I don't have to meaningfully support them. Or I now have a reason to justify exclusion. Let's look at another one.
I think we're running short on time. So
All right, we're going to do one more, and then I'm going to jump. So students failing reading. Doesn't want to try. This student doesn't want to try in class. That's the behavior. That's what we're saying. It's never not going to be hard for them. 10 minutes? Thank you. Again, the consequence is you escape having to meaningfully support the student, and you justify exclusionary practices. Okay? And so we are going to jump along. Everyone will have access to this PowerPoint. Fantastic. So we're going to look. There's 3 types of microaggressions. There's microassault, microinsult, microinvalidation. Okay? These all manifest through our implicit biases. And so probably at some point in our careers, we've all displayed these types of behaviors. Lean into that. So microassaults, those are a little bit more overt, similar to overt discrimination. They're intentional acts such as slurs, deliberate posting of hate symbols, or vandalizing or defacing religious buildings, etc. That's a microassault. Here's a trigger warning. Here are some examples of things that are microassault in nature, right? So what does that look like for students with disabilities? Well, we see this happening with students all the time, right? They use the R word. They call each other slow. They call each other spaz, right? And they call each other names. So those are microassaults. And when you hear that in your buildings,
oh, he's going to go get on that short bus.
Yep, that means that you need to really do a cultural reset building wide, because it's the culture that permits those things to flourish. Okay? So if you're hearing that, usually we just respond to the kid. We really need to be responding to the community in those cases.
And it's not just it's not just students, it's also teachers.
Also teachers, yep. Yeah. And these next 2 I see with teachers.
Something like,
did
you take your medicine today?
Ooh, yep.
Not ever, ever. Okay.
So what's a micro-insult? Well, this is a comment that communicates that a demographic's not respected. Like, it'll imply that a person is an exception to a stereotype, right? It's an insult, even though to the perpetrator, they think that they're sharing a comment, right? Oblivious. So it's like, I like your name, but I can't pronounce it. Like, can you go by Nash in class? So what does that look like for students with disabilities? He did great in my class today. Didn't do any work, but no tantrums, right?
Who's been there?
Yeah.
I may or may not have said something.
It's like, let me praise you and throw shade.
We were looking for the positives, but it wasn't really a positive, was it?
She looks normal for a child with autism. He is an EMN. He's just BAD.
Who's heard that one?
Yep. So we're going to skip this activity for the sake of time and talk about micro-invalidations. So these are comments or actions that dismiss the experiences of the historically disadvantaged group members, right? So like a common one is like when you hear someone like, they're like, I don't see color. Yeah, but like, then you don't see the person, right? So that's a micro-invalidation. Or when those critiques are raised and somebody's like, well, it's just open season on white males. I'm just always getting criticized. You're invalidating or undermining the concerns that are being raised, okay? And so this applies to all marginalized groups. And so thinking about students with disabilities, how are we invalidating them on a day-to-day basis? Don't worry about the assignment. It's not on your level. The student comes to you and they want to engage in productive struggle, and then you invalidate it. Or, sure, he can come to my class, but I doubt he'll get anything out of it. Yep. Think about those classrooms that we talked about a couple minutes ago, right? Are you seeing these classrooms in these statements? Don't expect any support from the family on this case. Don't expect any support. Invalidation. Okay, so we are going to...
So we're going to wrap up. We have two final activities, and then we'll hand it back to you for Q&A. These shouldn't take but 2 minutes. Do we have that?
4 minutes.
Oh, 4 minutes, even better.
Oh, yeah.
So on a sheet of note paper, whatever we gave you, list a few micro invalidations that are often used towards students with disabilities. We gave you a few examples. Can you think of another one?
You can also include a micro insult, okay?
So remember the difference. Do you want to scroll back to the definition of a micro invalidation for those who want a refresher? Can you think of an example? An action that dismisses the experiences of a historically disadvantaged group, such as somebody with a disability.
Speaking of a kid that has ID, that's cool. Yeah, that's what we said. I can't wait to take this back to school.
Again, I love the facial expressions.
And some of them are borderline. They might be they could fall into a couple of these categories.
Yep. How many times do we, have we made a joke about a student, right?
I
and
think
we think we're being playful, but what we're really doing is trying to get under the cognitive dissonance that we are unable to support them, right? So then we make the problem about the kid and not us. All right, bring it back in 3, 2, 1. And can we hear an example?
Anybody have an example of a micro invalidation or a micro insult?
Go back to the prompts.
She got one.
Okay, let's hear it.
It says, "You don't look smart."
Ooh.
You don't look smart.
So for a child who has not been diagnosed on the spectrum, but they just don't have much to say that very day, they come in and they're really quiet, and for the teacher to say, "So, are you autistic today?"
Oof.
That's insulting.
Yep. Yep.
What if you have a kid who can't access something physically that you've orchestrated because you didn't make it accessible, and you say, "Well, don't worry about this activity. Just go ahead and sit on the side. You can watch and I'll give you credit for it."
A good one I hear in a lot of college classes, "I'm just having an ADHD moment or an ADD moment." Everybody has ADHD, or, you know. Yeah, I hear that a lot.
They happen every day, more than you probably even realize. All right, let's go on to the next one.
All right, and this is our
So
next activity.
we technically, I guess, have 2 more, but we can skip the last one if we don't have time.
I agree.
So with your table, discuss the micro invalidations you had and draw connections between them and what we do as special educators. And then the big connection here, how does it relate to the legal components we discussed earlier? And be prepared to share out. So thinking about those access points that are legally, our students are legally entitled to, and then how these micro invalidations might impact our ability to provide that legal education that they're entitled to. That's a big think.
Yeah, this is like the grand overarching question, right?
And how does that impact our inclusive practices and mindsets?
We're coming up on about 1 minute, right?
They could do.
Yep.
Or they could bring to a gen ed classroom. You just look at all that they can't do.
All right, I hear a good conversation, so
Calling
come
y'all
on.
out.
Come on.
I said, as special educators, we are known for not looking at the disability, not identifying a kid as having SLD, ID, or anything like that. And I think, I don't even know what I said now, because you put me on the spot. What'd I say? I know, a lot of pressure. What'd I say? Add to it. Go. Anyway, you shouldn't look at a kid for what they can't do. You need to look at what they could possibly do. You don't need to say, well, they have SLD or they have ID, so we're going to stick them in the behavior room just because they have that label. You don't need to see the label.
For example, if you know a child cannot read, and you're in there with another teacher, and she's about to ask that child to read, and you don't say, don't ask her, because she can't.
Yeah.
She can't do it. Let's ask another student. You know, I've seen it happen.
So my closing statement would be this, on the topic of the legal components. You can follow the letter of the law, but are you following the spirit of the law? Okay, because there is a spirit behind IDEA, right? And so we can put kids in classroom and follow the letter of the law, but if it's not meaningful and we don't believe in them, we're not in the spirit of IDEA. Any parting questions?
Just, thank you.
No. There we go. Sorry. Oh, I'm supposed to bow. Apologies. Thank you all.
Wow. Mr. Floor, Dr. Cook, amazing. It was a goosebump moment in this presentation. Before we wrap it up, within a minute, does anyone have a question from the room? We have no questions online today, but does anyone have a question here today?
Do you guys speak at other places?
Do we speak at other things? We speak at Metro ad nauseum.
Like, are you open to coming to other counties to speak?
Well, we need to set some rates now.
Like we've done conferences and stuff like that before, so just, I guess, email us. Yeah, email us and then we'll talk to the boss.
Okay. Yeah, that was my question too.
Yeah, so our emails, I don't know if we put them out there, but are they on any of the communications? Yes. Okay. Yes. It's just our first dot last name at mnps.org.
And let me remind everyone, this presentation is online and others can go and view this after today. And as all of our presentations are online at mtsu.edu/CEM.